Hello and welcome to this first episode of the Inside Stream. This is a new podcast series and it involves an exploration of where science meets philosophy, dealing with everything, life and the universe, everything in between and everything beyond. I'm Akhandadhi Das. I'll explain a little bit more about myself perhaps during the session. And today, I'm really honored to be able to at least introduce this series to you. There will be different hosts and participants for every session. But today, it's very exciting because I have a very special guest in the studio, or at least in another studio online with me. And this series is being provided to you by the Bhaktivedanta Institute, who are based in Gainesville, Florida. And this particular podcast will explore the different connections between the disciplines of science and philosophy, and showing that when they're combined, they can offer a deeper understanding of the world and our place in it. So in this debut episode, we'll be exploring the topic of bringing philosophy to science. Now, in case you're trying to place my accent, I'm from Ireland. In the days after the Roman conquest, it was known as the land of saints and scholars. I can't claim anything like that, but my guest today is an old friend, and I would definitely class him as both a saint and a scholar. It's Hridayananda das Goswami. And in scholarship terms, he got his BA in UCLA in world religions and then completed what was considered the fastest ever PhD in the history of Sanskrit and Indian Studies department at Berkeley, at Harvard University. And Harvard actually published his thesis. So if you like what you hear from him today, there's always a chance to explore more of his papers and writings. Hridayananda Goswami, very pleased that you could join us today for this inaugural session of the Insight Stream.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about your own personal journey? You're studying world religions, you're studying Sanskrit, Indian philosophies. How does all this fit together, and how did it come about that you embarked on that research?
Yes. I first came across this tradition, Vaishnav tradition, when I was a student at Berkeley in the late 60s. I was very much involved in all the political activity there in Berkeley. And as so many other people were, quote unquote, searching for some higher truth. And I met the person, Swami Prabhupada, who became my spiritual teacher. And I took up a disciplined spiritual practice, somewhat reluctantly, because I wanted to enjoy the world. But I did take up a disciplined spiritual practice in September of 1969, practice which I still maintain. And I was instantly and spontaneously attracted to the Sanskrit language and the literature of the Sanskrit language, especially within this particular tradition, which is the main Krishna tradition, which is the main monotheistic tradition of what is now called Hinduism. And so I eventually began to study Sanskrit. I somehow was given all kinds of leadership positions. I found myself in charge of 25 countries when I was about 25 years old.
Now, when you say you were in charge of 25 countries, well, as the prime minister or president of them, or
both? No, actually, as this is within ISKCON, so it didn't actually give me a lot of power, but I was given the responsibility of trying to bring the teachings, bring this knowledge to Latin America. And that was in 1974. So 74, 75 in Latin America was kind of like 68 and 69 in California. And of course, now that lag time is kind of gone with instant communication nowadays. There really isn't that much difference in what's going on in these different parts of the world, but it was very successful. it grew very quickly, and suddenly I found myself being the biggest publisher of books on India uh, in Spanish and Portuguese. And so we printed lots of books. I translated books into helped translate books into Spanish and Portuguese. After that, I had a real longing to go back to academia. I really I wanted to I found myself managing all these different, dozens of projects in many countries, but it's not really what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be a manager. And so eventually I went back to college, completed all my degrees, and kind of did whatever I've done. And now I'd say my main focus, if I can just briefly say this, is trying to, how should I put it? In almost in a Western sense, you could say rationalize. I received all these teachings, and so obviously the mode of presentation, the assumption, the legitimate assumptions which you can make in let's say in South Indian thought are different than the let's say acceptable philosophical assumptions, or what constitutes a valid argument, what can you cite as evidence. It's a very different culture. In India, for example, you can just say, well, in the Bhagavad Gita it says this, or in the Bhagavatam it says that, and therefore everyone says, okay, then that's true, you win. Obviously that doesn't work at all in the Western world. And so I've been engaged really in trying to find a way to explain what I'm doing and what I think is true in a way that's rational according to the standards of a very different civilization. And
Obviously,
yeah,
you've got a long kind of involvement with theology, world religions, the Sanskrit language of the Vedic tradition, in particular, the Vaishnava aspect of the approach to Vedic knowledge. So, what brings you closer to philosophy and science then? Why did
okay,
these become of interest to you?
right. Well, first of all, if you look at Western philosophy, in just, roughly speaking, and if you look at what you could call South Asian theology, it's kind of like a meeting point, because if you compare, let's say, the philosophy of religion, which is a field, within academic philosophy, and then if you look at philosophical theology, the field within theology, there's a tremendous amount of overlap.
Okay, so
And yes,
we have theology, we have philosophy, and we have science.
so science, yeah, the interest in science is because uh, right now, philosophy achieved a type of epistemological hegemony, at least in the academy, in the sense that if you really want to claim that you've proved something, not just to yourself or not just to the people who belong to your group, but you've actually proved something objectively, to the extent, I won't get into the whole postmodern take on objectivity, which I think is a little silly. But if you want to, let's say, claim among educated people that you've demonstrated something or proved it, or whatever word we use now, then it's kind of like the king of the hill has been uh, physicalism, or empiricism, I should say. The methodology is empiricism. And of course, this reached kind of an absurd extreme in the 1920s, in the Wienkreis, the Circle of Vienna, where you get logical positivism claiming that nothing can actually, we can't accept anything as objectively true unless it can be empirically verified. And of course, that was, and the problem with that is you can't objectively verify empirically that everything has to be objectively verified. So it was rejected by leading Western philosophers as self-contradictory. However, that didn't really filter down to the general population. It didn't even filter down to the general academy. And so you still have this sort of this lingering contradictory, self-contradictory belief that ultimately empiricism is gold standard of objectivity. And so, and then just one more point, and then I'll stop for now. And that is that so I was going to say, it just slipped my mind that well, anyway, it slipped my mind. So go ahead. I'll stop interrupting you. Go ahead. And then
Well, I was just wondering that you mentioned about the hegemony of, previously that would have been of theology, that people accepted simply because it says so in their particular scripture.
right.
So it doesn't seem that creating another system of empirical science, in one sense, that's a good thing, surely, because it helps to clarify a lot of practical aspects, which scriptural sources may not be much help in.
True, but it also obfuscates and completely distorts the most important things in life. Like to give one simple example. Nowadays, civilized people are expected to believe that even though empirically we all have different abilities. For example, I'm not a competitive weightlifter in the Olympics, and so obviously we're not physically equal, we're not intellectually equal. There are elite universities where not everybody gets in, or not everyone gets a Nobel Prize. So from the empirical point of view, nothing could be more obvious than that we're not all the same. However, over and above that physical fact, any civilized person is expected to accept a metaphysical fact and a non-empirical fact, and that is we're all equal. So therefore, we all deserve equal justice under the law. We should all have equal opportunity. So that equality, which forms the basis of our political, ethical, judicial, and legal systems, so it actually is the foundation of what we call civilization. And this equality of justice, of opportunity, is actually what we, Western thinkers commonly brag about as what makes us different and better than previous civilizations. And yet that fact is empirical nonsense. I don't mean it's not true, but
empirical nonsense, or is it simply beyond empirical
well,
proof?
I was about to say that I'm using nonsense in the literal sense of the word. It makes no sense empirically. I don't mean it's wrong. I just mean empirically it's unintelligible, unprovable, and according to logical positivism, entirely meaningless. So, and yet we all, I think, accept that it's true, and it's the foundation of what we call civilization. So therefore, if you except that you live in a bidimensional universe. You live in a universe which has a physical, empirical, or empirically knowable reality, but you also live in a metaphysical universe. So the problem, the reason that the world, as as the cliche goes, is going to hell in a handbasket is because there's been all this emphasis on physical science and almost a complete neglect of metaphysical science. And this terrible imbalance in the world is threatening civilization. And it's just in terms of Hegel's dialectic, although he didn't use that word, thesis and antithesis, it's Newton's third law of motion. Every force in the universe creates an equal and opposite force. It's the pendulum effect. So what's happened is an extremely irrational metaphysical system, which is oppressive fanatical religion, which ruled Europe for some time, has created an equal and opposite monster, which is an equally irrational, equally dangerous physicalist fanaticism, which prevents us, it's like an anticoagulant that prevents us from actually agreeing upon certain higher principles that could actually save and enlighten our civilization. So that's what's at stake.
All right, well, let's just clarify a few things and build up the argument a little bit. First of all, I think your first point is that empiricism works within a certain kind of area of our lives and, interaction with the world. But there's all the other aspects which you mentioned, values and ethics, and the kind of higher level judgments we make about what it is to be human. Those cannot be defined in empirical terms. They cannot be verified in empirical terms, but we accept them as true, and we want them, we want to have them as standards in our lives. So there seems to be this limit to what empiricism can tell us about who we are and what we should be doing in this world. Is that your standpoint?
Yes. And if I could, yeah, exactly. Well said. And just to insert one little point, the basic epistemological claim of, let's say, fanatical empiricism. I mean, empiricism in a balanced way is a great thing. I mean, I love the fact that I can go to the dentist or I can talk to you right now. So I'm all in favor of science, plus what it reveals about the world. But the problem is that if this logical positivism is claiming that to know something, you have to control it. That's dangerous, because the heart of the empirical method is the controlled experiment. And so therefore you can't study things that you can't control. And so therefore the claim that we can only know things by subjugating them, by controlling them, is a very dangerous way to look at life.
Okay, well, we've maybe kind of moving into a separate field of exploration where it's not just simply the kind of humanities interests of law, ethics, and love and all those things, but really what you're starting to kind of talk about are things about the world which can't be subject to the controlled experiment. I suppose, and it's part of my interest, a key one of those would be our own subjective consciousness, the fact that I experience being alive. How is that going to be experimented on, through a controlled experiment?
Right. Well, we can't. I mean, there are obviously in psychology and other fields like that, they do all kinds of experiments where they pay generally students, like $10 an hour, $20 an hour, and they subject them to things. But take, for example, the concept of the soul, the fact that although I'm presently doing business as this body, actually I am an eternal self. I'm an eternal, the center of a personal subjective awareness. And so sociology and psychology are notoriously intractable, or they resist all attempts to bring them down to the level of a totally predictable science. So that's what Freud wanted to do. Freud's dream was to make psychology a hard science like physics or chemistry. And of course, it failed for the simple reason that we have free will. And then if you actually believe that ultimately, as you said, personal conscious beings are just ultimately material machines, then free will goes out the window. Because if we're just physical machines, like for example, my computer doesn't have free will. So if I'm just ultimately a biomachine with the illusion of being a person, then I have no free will. If free will goes out the window, there's a few problems. Number one, no one is morally responsible for anything. So if you go out on the street and shoot some innocent person, you could just say, I didn't do anything because I don't exist. It's just the machine did it. You can't hold a machine morally culpable. And then, as actually one of the most prominent philosophers of our time and a self-declared atheist, John Searle, he said two interesting things, which at least are a tribute to his intellectual honesty. One thing he said is that, and I have the quote here, that he said, well, I guess that like physicalism is just my religion. And I'm not going to read them here, but I've, a big inventory of quotes from leading atheists admitting, philosophers, scientists, that, well, that's just my religion. I can't prove that. Another thing that Searle said, a problem with not having free will, apart from the problem that you can't hold anyone morally responsible for anything they do, you go out in the street and just, kill people, and that's not really technically immoral because we're just machines. Another problem is, as Searle pointed out, you can't actually live that way. He gave an example, which I thought was very clever. You go to a restaurant with a friend, the waiter comes and says, well, could you order now? And what are you going to say? Well, I'm just waiting for the neurology to order because actually I don't have any free will, so I have to wait till my neurology orders. I mean, you can't live that way. You can't live as if you have no free will. At every moment, when you wake up in the morning, you have to make a decision whether to get out of bed or not. And actually, let's say if unfortunately someone's very ill, they might decide not to get out of bed. So, and every time you make a decision, which you're doing constantly, you're constantly deciding things, and you decide things based on the values you hold. For example, it's more valuable to get out of bed than to stay in bed. Values are metaphysical. So to live a life with free will, to live an intentional life, and that's a big thing now, intentionality and all that. If you just a normal human life, at every moment you are deciding things based on values, and the set of all your values expressed by your free decisions is your philosophy. And so, in fact, everyone is philosophically not a physicalist, the way they live their life. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm just saying that a certain physicalist view would suggest that actually when you're in the restaurant, absolutely it is your neurons that will inspire you, because you will have the smell of a particular flavor come into your brain. It will be processed, it will spark a memory, and you'll go, I'll have the pizza.
There's a problem with that, though. I mean, the problem is not the pizza, because that might be what I ordered, but that's not the problem. But the problem with that is, let's say, for example, you're at a restaurant and you're about to order. And of course, there's a certain degree of physical conditioning where I just have a certain kind of body that likes certain kind of food. But what if, for example, I go into the restaurant and I smell the pizza, but I'm an ethical vegetarian? Because there seems to be some kind of bizarre trend where people who are vegetarians want to assure you it's not for moral reasons. Like, I don't want to be accused of being compassionate. It's for health reasons. But anyway, let's say you're in the restaurant and you're about to order based on your sort of neurological propensities. And suddenly you get a call that someone in your family is in, urgent need of something went really seriously wrong. And so therefore you override your neurological propensity to order certain pizza and on ethical grounds. So it becomes more difficult. Even if you study brain neurology, even if you study the brain, what we find is that when you come to very simple things like, I like this aroma better than that aroma, this flavor better than that flavor, yeah, it becomes a bit mechanical. But when you come to abstract ethical judgments, it's more difficult. And if you study this, you'll find that the physicalists exaggerate the extent to which we can correlate specific brain areas with free decisions, and also there's the old problem of sort of the egregiously common propensity to take correlation for causation. We can correlate brain states, and even the ability to correlate brain states with certain states of consciousness, that ability diminishes when we get to more abstract, more complex thinking. And so, but even if the time comes when you could get a more precise correlation than we have now, correlation is not causation. So it's there are all kinds of problems with the physicalist assumptions.
Yeah, it's part of the neuroscience project to try and show not just sensory responses are clearly kind of some neurological pathway and reaction to previous experiences. But they hope that they can be shown that there are higher order processes which might generate what we call values and ethics and morality and so on. And that speaks to what you were saying earlier, that this approach, which isn't verified in any way, is undermining certain aspects of our human way of understanding who we are and how we are to interact with others. And it's undermining our sense of civility. In fact, there was a 2008 experiment, I don't know if you're aware of this one, where they got two groups. And one group, they had some neuroscientists come in and explain to them that there is no free will. We can explain everything neurologically. After that, they ran a test that they had run earlier, a psychological test, to see if there was any differences of behavior. And sure enough, there was. They were more likely to cheat, they were less empathetic, and they had lower self-esteem, having been told that there's no free will. They did the other group, and in the other group, someone came along very upbeat and told them there was free will. They ran the tests on them. And the interesting thing was, with those who had been told that there is free will, there was absolutely no change. And the researchers, looking at this and trying to understand it and interview them, came to the conclusion it's because we all know we've got free will. They weren't being told anything different to what they already knew about themselves. So and I think this is the crux of what I sense is your antipathy against the physicalist project, that it actually has very serious ramifications on who we think we are and how we're going to live in this world and what we think our life is for. So I think it's worth us exploring just, well, is this a valid? We may be able to say this is not a very good thing for society, but can we establish that physicalism is not a valid metaphysical understanding of reality?
Great
How
question.
do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm going to have to pass the baton here to Aristotle.
I didn't know he was online, but it's great that we have him to call on.
His computer broke, so I'm speaking for him. Aristotle realized and articulated an extremely important point in philosophy. And since the topic is, philosophy and science, I'll just insert here that according to, just sort of standard histories, in the 19th century, and even earlier than that, it was understood that if you're a scientist and you want to take your experiments, your data, and bring them to the public arena, so to speak, to the town square, and claim that we now know something, not simply some technical experimental result, but what this means is, like, that's what Darwin did. He studied in the Galapagos Islands, this and that, but then he wanted to draw ultimately what was a metaphysical conclusion about this is the way things happen. And so to do that, you're interpreting your data. You have to interpret the data, otherwise it's just a bunch of numbers. And when you interpret things, you interpret according to certain assumptions and so on. And when you make presumptions and analytical presumptions, you're doing philosophy, you're doing epistemology. And so therefore it was understood up until not too long ago that if you're a serious scientist, I mean, of course, you just want to present data to other people, fine. But if you actually want to do experiments and then draw large conclusions, you have to know philosophy. You have to know the rules of logic. Otherwise, you're going to say something illogical, and so on. And so in the 20th century, early 20th century, because science was so successful, it really got quite full of itself. and decided sort of this typical hubris that, who needs philosophy? We can do it all. This is one-stop shopping for objectivity. But the problem is when you stop doing philosophy, you start to make kind of stupid philosophical claims. And the first example of like a really unintelligent, because self-contradictory philosophical claim is that everything has to be empirically verified. And so therefore the need for philosophy, it doesn't mean that a scientist has to be a specialist philosopher, but without knowing something about philosophy, you're going to make really silly claims. And so that's why we're doing this now. We're trying to reunite, not just bring philosophy and science together, but really bring them back together so that we have a balanced understanding of things. So I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Well, maybe I'll just keep exploring a little further. We were looking at validity of physicalism, but
Right.
I think what you're saying is the
It's
scientific
self-contradictory.
method has its particular limitations in terms of what it can study. Therefore, philosophically, if you're going to interpret only the results that are empirically presented to you, you have a limit to what you can pronounce on.
Absolutely. You can only pronounce on things you can control, and you can't control God, and you can't control. So physicalism, I'd say one of the main problems philosophically, perhaps the central problem, is it's self-contradictory. Because if you say that, why don't you just give a little definition of physicalism so everybody knows what we're
Well,
talking.
I mean, there are different versions of physicalism, naturalism, materialism, and I've heard and read different definitions for each of them. Physicalism tends to involve that everything has a naturalistic or a source or explanation that can be accounted for purely in terms of what we know of the natural world, and particularly know the natural world through physics, and that therefore there is no room for any entity or force or influence from anything outside of that system because it doesn't exist.
Right. Well, then you
It
see,
doesn't exist, there's no impact.
right. There's a bit of self-contradiction there because the claim itself is a metaphysical claim. And so, therefore, if you say nothing is really real unless it's empirically verified, but what about that claim? That claim is supposed to be real, but it's not empirical. And so it's kind of like this comical self-contradiction. And
Yeah,
and also it's also claiming that it's also claiming that you can't really know something unless you can control it. But that's a sort of a wild metaphysical claim. And so you can't escape. And by the way, I'm using metaphysics in a very special way because I'll just very briefly, Aristotle he didn't use the word metaphysics, as you always have to say, but it came out of his school, because Aristotle had a book called The Physics, and then about the physical world. And then like what followed that was the metaphysics, meta meaning afterwards or above. And so Aristotle says metaphysics talks about the first things, the most important things. I forgot to mention with it that you see, if you just confine yourself to the empirical and the physical, the problem is you can very easily be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. And I'll give one simple example. I make the empirical claim that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. You say, prove it. I put a pot of water on the stove with the thermometer in it, turn on the heat, and at 100 degrees Celsius, it boils. I say, I proved it. No, you haven't. I don't believe that's pure water. You might have put some chemical in the water, which changes the boiling point. I don't believe that's pure mercury, or I don't know if it is. So you've got to test the water. Then you've got to test the water testing things. Then you've got to test the chemicals that test the chemicals that test the water. In other words, you can be pushed in any empirical situation, you can be pushed into an infinite regress of proofs. And since Aristotle believed there is real knowledge, how do you escape the infinite regress? The answer he gave, which is also found, by the way, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, biography of Lord Chaitanya explicitly, it's also found in the Declaration of Independence, is that you must affirm sincerely, not just as a trick, that there's something which is self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The Declaration of Independence. And Aristotle gave the example, it's like an army which is being pushed back, it's in retreat. If it has any hope of victory, it has to stop and take a stand. And so therefore, as we find in a verse in one of the recensions of the Mahabharata, tarko pratishta, that mere logic cannot be the foundation, because logic can only study the relationships between claims or assertions, and therefore but then are the claims true? Like if it's true that all men are mortal, and if Socrates is a man, then deductively and necessarily it follows that Socrates is mortal. But you could say, well, all men are mortal. Then you get into the problem of induction. You get into the problem of empiricism, which is that you can show that something is extremely probable, but not necessarily true. Like if I say, for example, let's say John is a bachelor, and therefore John is married. If John is a bachelor, it must be the fact that he's not married. Or if I say that I produced a square circle, that is necessarily false just by what the words square and circle mean. So things are necessarily true in that analytic definitional way. But if I say, for example, there are no pink unicorns in Central Park in New York right now, that's not necessarily true. It's extremely likely that's true, and no one's really going to believe it's not true. However, technically, analytically, it could be true. And so therefore you have this problem of induction, or a well-known philosophical problem of empiricism.
But if you take your point about self-evident truth as the
Right.
axiom, I think physicalists would claim, well, we live in a world that seems to operate very nicely by physics, and therefore
Very nicely what?
That the world that we live in operates very nicely according to the laws of physics.
Yes.
And therefore,
but my soul doesn't.
I was going to come to that, but I'm saying that their approach would be, therefore, it seems quite a reasonable self-evident truth to postulate that maybe physics explains all of our existence.
No, that is an obviously false argument, which I can explain.
But surely any philosophy that relies on something that is self-evident has put its belief in that axiom. So it's just a question of what axiom you want to believe in.
It's not a zero-sum game. For example, one of the standard arguments given for physicalism, look what we've given you: dentistry and medicine and computers. However, there's one extremely important thing that physicalism did not give us, and without which the other stuff wouldn't work, and that is civilization. And by civilization, I mean the fact that I can walk down the street and it's very likely that a mob is not going to attack me, kill me, and eat me. And so if despite the checkered history of civilization, the fact that there's any justice at all, the fact that, let's say, parents love and take care of their children, good parents, the civilization, I mean in a moral sense, that doesn't come from empiricism. That comes from values. It comes from ethics. And those things are not physical, not empirical. And without them, I mean, the Nazis were actually technologically advanced for their time, but they were metaphysically deficient. And so mere empirical science will not even free you from cannibalism or genocide. So if the argument for physicalism, it's given us stuff, yes, and metaphysics has given us civilization. They've given us what we need to even have the possibility of a moral society in which it's even worth being alive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, perhaps there's other examples that we'll look at that may illustrate the point even more precisely. Civilization and the ability of humans to try and cooperate is part of the physicalist project to explain how these have evolutionary benefits of cooperation.
They cannot explain it. They can't explain it.
Really the only reason that we have civilization is because it works to our own individual benefit.
Actually, it doesn't.
Cooperation, and to say, look, I'll agree to this if you all agree to it too.
No.
That,
Nice try, but that doesn't even come close to explaining things. Because for one thing,
it doesn't explain why we as humans feel life should be fair, life should be just. We have that. It's almost intrinsic to believing free will. We believe that that things should be fair.
It is intrinsic, because if we have free will, we're morally responsible. But you see, it's also, just in the point of view of logic, it's kind of a clownish case of begging the question. Circular reasoning. Circular reasoning means it's like, for example, let's say I claim that there's a real physical world out there. And so, like in a typical syllogism, like, argument's conclusion. So therefore I say, well, there's a real physical world out there. Okay, here's one proof, because let's say I'm holding up this glass of cup. It's actually not glass. I'm holding up this non-glass glass of water, and it's real. Therefore, there's real physical world. But this is a real glass of water and not an illusion, only if there is a real physical world. So if you have a syllogism where the premises are true only if the conclusion is true, and the conclusion is true only if the premises are true, it's circular reasoning. And so if you say that I claim that, the only thing that really exists is physical things, everything, what we believe are moral values are really just, we're just neurologically, just neural programming. But that's true only if your conclusion is true. And so therefore, you haven't given an argument for physicalism. You've just gone around in a circle. And
what I was trying to establish was that it's got its self-evident axiom, and it's trying to be consistent with that
And what is a self-evident axiom?
That everything is physics, or everything can be explained by physics.
Okay, so that's their. But the problem is,
if you accept it as a belief,
but the problem is, it is not self-evident to almost everybody. In other words, I could say it's self-evident that the world is made out of purple Munster cheese, and that's self-evident to me, but that's absurd because it's not self-evident to anyone else. And even the atheist Searle, prominent philosopher, admitted that no one can actually live a life as if they don't have free will. Why? Because at every moment we experience, and we're talking about what presents itself to people immediately and self-evidently, not some explanation that you can give. So what I'm saying is, it's not self-evident. It's to almost everyone that if I go out on the street and kill a bunch of innocent people, that I'm not morally responsible, because in fact, that was just mechanistic neurology. And so you can't say if it's self-evident, it's only to an extremely tiny minority of people is it self-evident, and you can't organize a society based on such idiosyncratic assumptions that almost everyone finds nonsensical.
Okay, so what we're defining here is that the commitment to physicalism is based on individuals, say, accepting a particular what they consider to be self-evident, but which may not be evident to others, but they may be very committed to that because they see no reason not to believe in that.
You really softened it to say it may not be self-evident to others. That's your description of the reality, where it's totally nonsense to almost everybody.
Well, I was going to tell the story. A few years ago, I had a podcast with David Papineau, who is a very prominent physicalist. In fact, he's probably quoted in all the different things. He has an a posteriori theory of physicalism or justification. And it's on the basis that whatever we examine is physical. Whatever we examine is physical, therefore everything must be physical. Now, there's two big problems in that. One is what, do you count free will? Do you count the ethics and the values that we follow? Do we call those physical? And when it comes to consciousness, are we sure that when we study it, we know this is physical? Is mind absolutely physical? And
yeah, well, his claim is silly because one of the things that a good person does all the time is to examine their conscience. For example, let's say I'm angry and I want to say something kind of unkind to someone, and then I stop and I examine my own conscience. So to say everything we examine is physical is ludicrous. It's just, and the word ludicrous, by the way, means something which is so absurd it's comical.
This is the point, that he will consider that anything you look at within your mind is part of the physical makeup of your
Great question, begging, great circular reasoning.
It's circular argument. But there's one more aspect to this, which I raised with him, that I think is very pertinent to our discussion. And that is, if you are proving physicalism on the basis that you will keep looking and regarding everything and asking, is it physical? And if it's physical, fine. If it's not, you've got a problem. But if that's your process for establishing physicalism, then you can never use physicalism as a way of interpreting the world.
Great point.
Because that's the circular point. You're still trying to find out if everything's physical. Therefore, you cannot use physicalism as the basis for interpretation. Therefore, it should be removed from all scientific interpretation.
Brilliant.
And this is the role of philosophy. I think you were saying earlier. We actually have to look at where philosophy and science need to work together, hold together, in order to be sensible truth.
Yes, religion shouldn't try to dominate science, and science shouldn't try to dominate spirituality. It's aggressive. It's what's that word? It's just imperialist. The problem, the point is very simple. A good human life involves a balance between physical duties, physical knowledge, and the metaphysical. There's a natural balance. But when my neighbor wants to come and take over my house, that's criminal. And so if everyone will just do what they do, it's this aggressive, hegemonic attempt, which historians all talk about. This is standard mainstream, academic history. When science wants to take over everything and subjugate all other forms of knowledge, it's a problem. Just like, it's always a problem in human society when one person wants to subjugate another and just, inappropriately. And so we
don't want the pendulum to swing back from hegemony of science to the hegemony of religion. Where does philosophy fit in to produce this balance?
Philosophy is the referee to make sure that everyone is reasoning in a fair way. So like this Papa now, this thing he said, which is just, it's just amazing that philosophers would actually say things like that, which are so unphilosophical. The referee steps in and says, that's a low blow. And so what philosophy does is it regulates, it makes sure that everyone is being reasonable, not contradicting themselves. In other words, they have to pass the coherentist test. If you look at the main ways that in philosophy that people try to verify that a statement is reasonable, of course, foundationalism is what we talked about. That comes from Aristotle. You have to avoid an infinite regress of proofs by sincerely and plausibly asserting that something is self-evident, which, by the way, that's exactly the word that Chaitanya used in his discussions with Sarvabhauma and Prakashananda, swata pramanam, self-evident. And so So that's what philosophy does to regulate it and to throw down, red flag when someone is being unreasonable.
So does philosophy have to have, does it have to be based on self-evident truth? And if so, what would you offer as
Oh, okay. So just, yeah, okay. To answer that, one thing is a foundationalism, which we just talked about. The other thing is coherentism, which is not really a substitute for foundationalism. Some people think so, but most people realize it's not, because coherentism means that it's almost like a physical image, that the structure of a knowledge system is not like a house, foundation, then you build the superstructure, the walls, the roof, but rather the basis, not use the word foundation, the basis of let's say good philosophy is sort of more like a web, where if you look at the nature of a web, everything supports everything else. My point is, though, you still need foundationalism to decide who gets into the web, because you don't want in these, say, interdependent web, you don't want a silly statement that everyone knows isn't true. And so therefore, coherentism doesn't really replace foundationalism, but it is a necessary test. In other words, I can say this is my foundation, and this is my superstructure, this is my knowledge system, but if it's incoherent, it doesn't work.
Yeah. So a good case for foundationalism and coherentism together. And back to my question, what would
Yes.
you call it now as the self-evident truths that could find wider acceptance and work well, not only for philosophy, but work for religion and even science together?
Yeah, I think there is a sort of an implicit cogito ergo sum in the Bhagavad Gita. Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am," because the one fact that I can't doubt, that I know more than I know anything else, is that I exist and I'm thinking about things. And so it's so interesting. You get these highly opinionated atheist philosophers who, their personality is like dripping over everything they say and claiming there's no person. It's kind of amusing. But Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, the Sanskrit is dehi nosmin jata dehi, which means literally just as in this body. Dehi nosmin jata dehi, komarang jovanam jara. We experience childhood, youth, and then old age. And then tata, similarly, dehantara, another body prapti one attains. Dhiras, a wise person, tatra, in this matter, namuyati, is not confused. Now, there's an unstated premise, which is really what makes it work. And the unstated premise is that, komarang jovanam jara, when you experience childhood, youth, and old age, you're the same person, even though the body's different. And so that's, I mean, Krishna is assuming that his listeners understand that. Nowadays, of course, it's Kali Yuga, it's a tough age we live in. So we have to flush out those implicit arguments that, the one thing we know, if you look at, just do a tiny bit of linguistic psychology. The fact that we all say, yeah, I was born in whatever. I was actually born in Los Angeles. I'm very proud of the fact that I was born in a hospital, which today is a center for Scientology. But anyway, so, I say that I was born in Los Angeles. I went to school, and I could tell you my schools, when I was 5, when I was 10, when I was whatever. Then I did this. And so I keep using the same pronoun. And so the most intuitive thing to everyone is that it was me. I was born there. I played as a kid in this park. These were my parents. Then I went to this school. No, that's the way everyone on earth talks. Why? Because it is clear to everyone on earth that was really me. And yet the body is radically different. And so that's the argument Krishna is giving.
Well, and it's actually the same. I think Jiva Goswami develops that very nicely He's another Vaishnav philosopher, though much later, 16th century. And he developed it as not only do I exist and know that I have this sense of existence, and that is something that is common, and that is something that is knowable to us, but it is not, it's not empirically known, it's not philosophically, it's just known to us. There is a way of knowing I exist that supersedes all other things. So it is a self-evident truth. And he extends it further. And and I know I exist because I experience. I feel, I experience, I learn, I know things, and so on. And I experience otherness. I experience the world, I experience my body, I even experience the thoughts in my mind. So I am the observer of all of this. I am the subject experiencer. And he's building up this case. And as you say, he then says, I am the persistent knower within this body. And therefore, I'm observing the passing of time. And therefore, is me outside of time. Everything else is being affected and changed by time, but I'm remaining above that. You could say transcendental to it. And therefore, what do I know about me as this conscious being that is so self-evident? And surely all science, philosophy, and religion should play to that.
Yeah, very, very well said by Jivan, by you.
Jiva Goswami, we give him full credit on this. And it seems to me that the self-evidence can be extended a bit further, that whether we're in philosophy, science, or religion, there is a postulation of something that is the absolute, something from which everything else comes. And that's how Vedanta starts. What is this thing that from which everything else comes? And really, we got two choices, I think, in this. Two basic choices. Is that thing which is the ultimate source, is it conscious, as I am, as I experience myself? Or is it inert, as I seem to experience the things of this world? Which is it, inert or conscious? And I think that really is the defining question for what people take as being self-evident. Now, if you say that it is inert, then you have to explain how something which seems categorically different in quality and function and property as consciousness emerges from something inert.
Yes, which...
Except that it is conscious, you have to explain how something which appears inert emerges from that which was conscious.
But although I don't think we are claiming, that would be the question if we're talking about how God, because we don't manifest the world. Although Krishna says in the Gita that prakriting purusham chaiva vidyanadi ubhavapi, that technically both matter and spirit, to use those simple terms, have always existed, and so there's not literally a matter coming out of the spirit. They just have always existed. Just one other point. I like very much everything you've been explaining, but another thing, like you said, I think, and that's a very important point you made, that we just know that we exist. We don't know it empirically. I don't go out and do a test and conclude that I exist. It's an a priori understanding. And also, it's a metaphysical assumption we make that we cannot empirically prove, that other people have minds, that other people are conscious. I can't prove that you are conscious, but I know you are.
Sorry, I'm a chatbot, and proving you all this time. I passed the Turing test. Way. No, we can't know that, but somehow or other we do know it.
Yeah, we do. We can't empirically know it, but I think we have to make a very clear distinction between knowing and empirically knowing. Empirically knowing is a subcategory of knowing. it doesn't coincide with knowing. It's a subcategory. I know, for example, that I shouldn't burn down my house. I know that I shouldn't harm other people. I know that it would be very interesting to speak with you. I mean, there's all kinds of things that I know that I'm not programmed to think that way. They're actually true. And yet, and there's a very common argument against physicalism that in evolution, natural selection selects survivability, not accuracy. So, for example, let's say there's some danger, and so I decide that, well, my best hope for survival is this or that. Of course, maybe wrong, but and so if something bestows a survival advantage, like let's say, for example, porpoises. In porpoises, also, we tend to sort of glamorize them as very conscious, but they do have alpha males. They are, there are male, you can't say male chauvinist pigs because they're not pigs or porpoises, but there are male chauvinist porpoises. And what happens is the alpha male kind of beats down all the other and gets to mate with all the females. Now, let's say if some man goes into a town and just sort of beats up all the other men or intimidates them and then kind of reproduces with all the women in the town, even though they're married to other men or in love with other men, we would hardly think that was right. And yet it might be better. I mean, having an alpha male reproduce with all the females, in a sense, could produce the most robust, durable, survivable next generation. And so so you can't always equate. The ethical doesn't always bestow survival advantage. For example, when I was in British Columbia visiting the Gitanagari farm, and they told me it's just like millions of Douglas fir trees everywhere on the mountains there surrounding the valley. And they said that these great Canadian forests are actually becoming weaker because the government puts out and prevents forest fires. And so preventing, I mean, let's say, massacres and genocide. I mean, Hitler, it's been documented, although, the Liberal Academy doesn't like to admit this, but it's been well documented that Hitler and the other Nazis thought they were carrying out a Darwinian project. That's what they felt was the moral justification. This is survival of the fittest. We are improving the human race by eliminating races that we think are, shouldn't be around. And so if you really think, and so genocide is something that would be, if you're a physicalist, genocide could be the way to go. For example, we have an environmental problem on the earth. And so last point I'll make, we have an environmental problem. There's a very easy solution to the environmental problem: genocide. Let's say we now have about 8 billion people. Okay, what if we murdered 6 billion people? Environmentally, that would be fantastic. Morally, it would be the most horrible thing ever. So you cannot reduce ethics to natural selection and neurology selecting survivability or just survivability selecting itself. It doesn't explain all kinds of metaphysical things.
Okay, now we've just got a few minutes left for our conversation today. What would you like to see come out of the series of the Insight Stream? What sort of topics and issues to be explored?
Those are okay. What issues should be explored, or what should the purpose be for exploring any issue at all?
Tell us what you would like to see on this podcast in future.
Relevance, sort of big ticket items. I don't think we should be ivory tower academics that just amuse ourselves intellectually. And frankly, there's too much of that going on. I mean, it goes on massively among just scholars in general, at least in my field. And I think we should be concerned and relevant, caring public intellectuals. I think we should talk about things where, something's at stake, in a sense, the world is at stake, as we know from history. If you're sort of, off maybe 10 degrees morally, your civilization may end up in tragedy.
Thank you. So we're looking for an intellectual, but intellectual with relevance and with heart and with a full appreciation of all the actual values and interests of us as conscious beings in humanity and what we can do for the world, and to try and achieve a better balance between the roles and functions of particularly science and technology and what it can do to help us, and understanding how it can be used, and at the same time understanding the insights from spiritual traditions and wisdom traditions in what they can apply. But philosophy seems to be the nexus around which these traditions can work together,
Absolutely.
harmonize, and actually offer kind of great benefit to society. Hridayananda Goswami, thank you very much for being the first guest on the Insight Stream, where science meets philosophy. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in and listened to this. This was the inaugural episode. We hope you enjoyed it. Maybe you didn't agree with everything that we said, but we hope that it was at least thought-provoking and has inspired you to explore perhaps the role of philosophy in bringing the different aspects of how we know and the world and find our place within it, particularly issues science, religion, philosophy together. Now, in our next episode, we're very pleased to welcome Louis Ritz, who is the Associate Professor Emeritus at the University of Florida. And he is going to delve into the topic of near-death experiences. So you may not want to miss his, he's a wonderful speaker, lovely gentleman. And we spent a great time together exploring the alligators down there in near Gainesville. So you won't want to miss his conversation as we explore aspects of philosophy and science and see if we can come up with some thoughts and ideas that may have an interest and impact in your life. So see you next time.
Thank you.